Produced by Podcast Architects.
You're listening to the Lead On podcast, where we discuss experiences in the armed forces while exploring lessons from military leaders.
Hey, welcome back to another edition of Lead On, Lessons from Military Leaders. I'm David Deary with the Enlisted Leadership Foundation, and I'm excited to have a conversation today with Rachel Oswalt. Rachel is a Navy veteran. She was in aviation. She hails from Iowa, is it, I believe you said?
Yes,
And
Iowa.
Man, I'm excited to talk to you and have you share your passion, your mission, a little bit how our paths cross. So, Rachel, thanks for being here today, and thanks for your service.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, David. I've been so excited and looking forward to this since we were first introduced and met, and excited to get into the conversation today.
You know, I went and listened to the podcast, your podcast, which if you look at the show notes, everybody you'll see a link to listen to Rachel's podcast. And she interviewed Jim Rich a few months ago, and I was so impressed by you and your podcast, your message, and I just want to be able to expand your reach through mine as well. And, hopefully as a result of both of ours, more people will invite you on.
Yeah. Jim was a phenomenal guest. I learned so much from him. He's such a wealth of knowledge. He's such a great person. And it was a really great time just getting to know him and learning more about him and more about what the Enlisted Leadership Foundation does too, because I don't think that there's enough awareness about that. And so it's cool to be able to collaborate with people like you and the people that work alongside you to really just get the word out there about the resources that are available out there.
Well, I sincerely appreciate that. Before we dive in, just to kind of lighten the mood, what's the worst piece of leadership advice someone ever gave you? Could be in the military or out of the military.
Ooh, I think in the military, someone once told me that it's a dog eat dog world, and that, how you look on paper. I actually heard this several times, believe it or not, in the military. How you look on paper is what really matters the most. And so what you do as a person doesn't matter. Just got to look good on paper, because that's how you rank up. And, that's some people's definition of a leader. So that's probably the worst.
It's funny. So I served, I joined a couple years before you did, and I was stationed on board a battleship back in the 80s. And I had an E6 tell me, I was an E4 at the time, say that you really just got to make sure the 3 months before evals, you shine your boondockers, you iron your dungarees, you don't make a mistake, because that's all they're going to remember. So, I think, and I would even go, having now fast forward, having sat selection boards. When I was on active duty, I did 4 or 5 of them. And there's some truth to that. And I will say for anybody out there listening, regardless if you're a branch of the military, if you are military, we see through that on selection boards. It's not hard to pick out of an eval, or, when people say, raised awareness by 75%. Okay, 75% of what? Does that mean that there was, 4 people out there and 3 of them? I don't know. So I'd rather see some, that you had 2 of 5 people re-enlist. Okay, give me some, good numbers like that. But that's good. So, so you joined the military from Iowa. Why did you join the Navy?
So, my story actually starts back in 2012. I initially joined the Navy in 2012. It was supposed to go as an HT, and I had joined at the time because the guy that I was in a relationship with was a very toxic relationship. I kind of needed a way out to get things figured out, and so I joined in 2012. But I actually ended up dropping out of the delayed entry program in 2012 because my living situation, everything, it just wasn't going to work out. And so the recruiter that I had talked to at that time told me, if you drop out of the delayed entry program, you can never join the Navy again. I said, okay,
Never.
not a big deal. Yeah, he said never. Okay. Obviously, we know there's waivers for everything, but, they're not going to tell me that because they're trying to convince me to stay. So I ended up dropping anyway. But in 2014, that exact same recruiter came back to me and said, hey, so we're letting people, right? We're letting people in the Navy, but it's like a one-time thing. And like, you have this much time to make a decision. And, that should have been my red flag for this is how the military is, right? Quick decisions. But I was like, you know what? I'd actually just gotten out of that really bad relationship. And I was like, why not? This is something different. I was in a little bit better of a position because the first time that I had joined, I still owed some debt to the university that I was attending. And I would have had to join as an E1 and an HT. They really didn't give me a lot of options. The second time around that I joined, because I had that debt paid down, I was allowed to join as an E2 and I had more options. And so I actually decided to join as an air rescue swimmer. But since that's spec war, I had to do the PSTs. And so I had about, a year-long time frame where I was doing these PSTs to...
What's a PST for anyone that doesn't know?
PST. It's like a physical standard test or something.
Test.
I don't remember the exact acronym, but
it's okay. There's so many acronyms out there. You need there is,
but it consists of push-ups, pull-ups, dead hang pull-ups, sit-ups, a swim, and a run. And so it's a pretty physically intense test, and it was really, really cool preparing for that because I really learned a lot about myself and I grew as a person a lot just in that process of the delayed entry program. I went from being able to not do a single pull-up to 6 dead hang pull-ups. I went from a 15:30 mile and a half to an 11:30 mile and a half. I mean, I really exponentially grew as a person and it really set me up well for boot camp too. In doing that, I didn't actually end up going into the military in spec war. I didn't get picked up for a contract because the way that works is, you pass the test and then they send your name in with a pool of people. And then the Navy chooses, do we want to select you for this program? And because I had such a hard time passing my run, I passed it right before my cutoff date to leave for boot camp as an avionics technician. And I didn't get selected, but I was the only female in the entire state of Iowa that was going for a spec war program. And so it was very empowering. That's very cool. I mean, all these guys come in and they want to be SEALs, right? And our instructor was a former SEAL, really cool guy. Really loved him. He was awesome. And I grew a lot just in that time period. But I'd say ultimately at the end of the day, I joined to do something different with my life, to really change the trajectory of my life. Even though I went through stuff, it was probably one of the best decisions that I ever made. So
you went in 2014, and then when did you get out?
Well, so 2015 is when I left for boot camp because I enlisted in the delayed entry program in 2014, and I had about that year that I was trying to pass the PSTs. So 2015 is when I officially left for boot camp, officially joined the Navy, and then September 2021 is when I separated.
All right. So did it change your life?
Absolutely.
So you created the podcast. Your story doesn't end here. What story? Why that title?
Well, so the reason why I started my podcast is because I had lost a number of friends to suicide in the time that I was in the Navy. And, I just remember there was one day that I came across the words, "Your story doesn't end here" on the internet. And they really, really stuck out to me. And when my second coworker friend had passed from suicide, I actually got a tattoo on my forearm that said, "Your story doesn't end here." So I had the tattoo on my arm. It has the words, "Your story doesn't end here." It also has like a scroll. It has a timepiece. And it was really just like a symbolic thing of a tribute to everyone that I had lost from suicide. And so, when I decided to start a podcast, because I was really between like YouTube, podcast, what do I want to do to really get the message out there? And I decided to go with the podcast because YouTube's a lot of work, and video is a whole other layer. But I also like the anonymity that a podcast provided for my guests, because not all my guests are comfortable sharing their story. But everything combined, I chose the title "Your Story Doesn't End Here" because I think that when it comes to people in their mental health and suicide and these dark places that people get in when they're serving either in or outside of the military, there is so much more to someone's story. And if someone cuts their life short, they're ending that story where it's at. They're choosing the end of that story. And I get it. People are in so much pain to be at that point where they decide that, my last resort is to take my own life. But the message that I really wanted to send to my listeners that are struggling is, hey, like, your story doesn't end here. There's so much more to your story. There's so many more lives to impact. There's so many more experiences out there. There's people that care about you. I mean, it's really just like that all-encompassing phrase that lets people know, like, hey, there is more. There's another chapter. There's 10 more chapters. There's so much more to your life. And it's kind of symbolic of why I put the tattoo on my right forearm, because I wanted it to be one of those things where if I shake someone's hand and they see this tattoo on my arm, it lets them know that I'm a safe space. I'm someone that you can talk to. I might not understand every person's story, but you can talk to me. I can be that ear, and sometimes that's all people need.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so when it comes to, so you mentioned mental health, and we talked previously about mental health in the military. Um, you know, mental health has always been, uh, it's always been a thing. I don't know how else to say it. It's always been, but it's been a thing that has not been understood. I think it's getting more understood, but there's still, it's like you said earlier about, you want to help more people learn about the English Leadership Foundation, even though we've been around going on 9 years. um, because there's always new people coming in and coming up, right? So with mental health, there's always, you it's never a once and done. You never can get the word out and, okay, everybody's figured it out, let's move on to the next thing. So it's that repetitiveness, right? And and admittedly, I for many years, um, whether it's pride or arrogance, or maybe both, uh, not being a person who necessarily suffered from mental health. I never understood. I always felt there had to be a cause and effect. Things have to be black and white. That if you're feeling depressed, okay, then what is it that's making you feel depressed? So stop doing that, and you won't be depressed. I mean, but it's clearly not that simple. But I would tell you, and I probably shouldn't. You probably tell me. There's a lot of people out there that feel that way. Um, so how did you go about um, advocating for mental health change in active duty, and even since you've come out of the military, beyond obviously podcast, but
Yeah.
however?
So my podcast is a huge part of what I do. I'm always connecting with people to learn resources, to learn people's stories, and to figure out different ways to be able to help. Because I understand that my story is just one snippet of the picture. So I'll start with back in 2019. I actually created a petition to the McPon, who was Russell Smith at the time, and I started this petition well before I started the podcast, because I was in a place of immense pain mentally. And I realized that the mental health system was failing sailors. And this was my experience at my base. But in starting that petition, I spoke with tons of people. And when I was creating awareness for this petition, I had stories flooding into my inbox from officers, enlisted, people who are anonymous, just telling me these painful stories of what they'd gone through. And I think that's where it really hit me, how bad it was. Because I mean, I had problems, with the wait times that a lot of people have, right? The waiting 3 weeks, 3 months, that's kind of the norm in the military to go see a therapist, right? And I had my own set of issues. But when I started hearing these stories from people of the ways people were attempting to take their lives, experiences people had gone through, gaslighting, bad leadership, I was like, holy crap, like this is really bad. And so I created this petition to the McPon. And on top of that petition, I created a Word document. And in that Word document, I outlined these are different ways. And this is from research compiled, talking to different people. These are ways that we can change mental health now. These are things we can implement in a year, 5 years, 10 years. I mean, these are things. And then I included one or two stories from other people that had shared their stories with me and gave me permission to share that. And my hope with that was, hey, maybe this will be enough. Maybe hearing it directly from someone who's gone through it will be enough to spark that change. And unfortunately, I didn't see a lot of change that happened. I know down in San Diego, there was like a walk-in clinic that started, and I was really happy to hear that. But it wasn't the change that I really, really wanted to see. So, you know, one of the biggest reasons I started my podcast was that, but that's what I started beforehand. Now what I do to advocate on top of, you know, just building connections and meeting people is I'm located in the Whidbey Island area. I'm starting to do more community events in the area. One of them, there's a film that's coming out November of this year. It's called Stranger at Home, and it's advocating for legislative change to establish a mental health core. And so I'm working alongside them.
So in the research that you've done prior to the petition and beyond, and talking with all the people, has there been any common reason why that sticks out for, be it for suicide, but attempts or just mental health in general, or is there just, man, it's just such a wide variety of things. I'm just curious if there's just, maybe obviously there will be a wide variety, but is there one or two that you see common across the spectrum?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked this because I actually sat down with a city council member in my local area last week, and he actually also happens to be a funeral home director. And I was asking him about the suicides and if there's commonalities and the reasons why, and he said that most of the time the reason why people attempt suicide or they take their own life a lot of times has to do with a cheating spouse, cheating girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever have you. So that seems to be a huge commonality. And interesting enough, I was reading another study. There's a website called the Military Suicide Research Consortium that also linked suicide attempts to these relationship issues going on. And so it seems like I think that it is very multifaceted. I don't think that we can just say like, oh, if people's spouses stop cheating on them or whatever, or divorces didn't happen, that the suicide rate wouldn't be what it is. Because I think at the end of the day, it's like, what's the tipping point that makes someone feel like this is their only option? It does seem that from like a statistic standpoint, that the troops or soldiers, sailors, that have divorce issues or relationship issues, it seems that they are more at risk for suicide. And I truly believe that that's because the military is a stressful enough job, right? So when you go home and you don't have a safe space at all and everything's overwhelming in life, it can be that tipping point. And so, when we're talking about like, what's that biggest determining factor, it seems like that has a whole lot to do with it when it comes to suicides. Obviously not the end all be all, but a very big contributor.
So how do you recommend somebody, someone at a command and a leadership position, create a safe space?
I think to give you the simple answer to that, to just be human. I think
what does that mean?
The military has had this tradition for so long of hardness. And I say hardness meaning like, I'm the leader, I'm the person in charge. Yeah, I give you an order, you do what I say, and that's it. That's the end all be all, right? We lost that humanistic touch. And I don't know if the military really ever had that humanistic touch, but I've met people in the military who have it, and I've met a lot more who don't have it. And I will say that for me, I made it to E5 by the time I got out, but there was very few people that were in higher positions that I was comfortable going to and saying like, hey, I'm having a really rough day today. So if I seem off today, that's why. Or, I just need I need time. Like, just give me an hour or so. I'm just going to go breathe for a few minutes and then, whatever, like anytime, or, just whatever, name a situation, name a scenario. And I didn't feel comfortable having these conversations. But I'll tell you the reason why I didn't feel comfortable having these conversations is because of the types of responses that I was met with a lot of the times. I think also another side to that is hearing the side conversations that people have, even outside of a mental health crisis or outside of, maybe not even a crisis, but a bad day. Hearing people talk smack about mental health, hearing people make a joke about it. Suicide is a massive joke in the military, in my experience. People joke about it, maybe as a way to cope, I don't know, but when you hear people constantly joking about something and then knowing that you're also dealing with something at the same time, it can be very hard to approach someone in a serious manner and be like, hey, I'm really struggling. So I like to sum it up by saying the culture of the military is not what we're seeing as a culture on the civilian sector, what the civilian sector is moving towards, I should say. And it's interesting because when I joined the military in 2015, one of the first things I was told is that the military was trying to be more like corporate America. And so you can't adopt certain things that corporate America is doing and try to be more inclusive and try to, give people a safer environment to work in, but then say, oh, well, we're not going to try to look at these things in corporate America. But what I see in corporate America is that there are a lot of businesses and organizations that are offering mental health support to their staff and their employees. And I think that's an amazing thing. And I wish the military would be open to looking at this too. Obviously, it would probably look a little different because the military and civilian sector are still two completely different sectors. But one of the reasons why I really focus on changing the culture of mental health across the DoD organizations is because I truly think that to change the culture would be a massive disruptor to change mental health for the better. Implementing programs is one thing, right? Like you got to go through all the government red tape to implement a program or to hire a psychologist or psychiatrist. But what can we do to make people better leaders, better contributors, people that just listen? I use the example all the time of, when someone asks you, how are you today? And someone says, hey, I'm not good today. Like, can we talk? Most people aren't ready for that response. Most people just want to hear good, right? They want to hear good and they want to move on. But the number of chiefs that I had, commanding officers, whatever have you, that they ask you, oh, how are you doing today? And most people aren't going to say, hey, I'm actually not good today. They're just going to say good and they're going to move on and they're going to bottle it and carry on to whatever is heavy until sometimes it's too heavy and they can't handle it anymore.
There's a lot there we can unpack. Uh, having sat as a command master chief, and sat in, and even before then as a senior chief and a chief, uh, listen to these conversations, or listen to the opinions, right? Behind closed doors. Oh yeah, that sailor, and it's not 100% of the time, and it's not everybody. But you're right that there's a stigma, there's an opinion, there's an impression, and I hear that enough times that if I even myself, I'd be I like, okay, mental note. I don't want to bring anything up to these folks. And over time, I end up picking up, well, people who complain, they're just faking it. They're just making it, trying to get out of deployment or whatever. And I would, and that can create a stuck point, and that could actually prevent somebody from seeking mental help for themselves in the future. Because, like, wait a minute, I can't be experiencing something because I've been trained that that's a fake, that's not a real thing, right? And then when you talk, so one of my favorite books by John Maxwell is Five Levels of Leadership. And I'll comment to people, and listen, this isn't meant to be derogatory at all towards the military. This is just, I think, a fact. But the first level is the positional level of leadership, the very first, right? People follow you because they have to. And so it's that rank structure. And we are great in the military about the positional level of leadership. And just one level up is that permission level. People follow you because they want to. And then beyond that is production. People follow you because of what you've done for the organization. And just to point back for a second to the Enlisted Leadership Foundation, our goal is just to get you to that second level. Get out of the position and get to the permission. It builds relationships, and those relationships, they all start with communication. So when you say, "Hey, how you doing today?" and when they say, "Oh, I'm good," are you? Are you good? Are you really good? Because if you're not, I got a few minutes. It just Even if you just take that, and they may not answer. They may say, "No, no, I'm good." But it's that observation on how you do it over time that builds that trust. And I had a sailor once come to my office, E5 on a ship. He was upset about his eval. He had a different opinion of himself than his chain of command had. Um, and I shared with him. I said, "I think that you probably have a more accurate opinion of who you are through your eval than what you have on yourself. You may not want to hear that, but I really think you need to take a step back and just look and just see if maybe this isn't 100% correct." But and he came back. He left kind of a little bit upset. But he came back a week later. He says, "Master Chief, I've been thinking about it, and you're right. There are some things that I think I need to do better, and so I appreciate that." Fast forward about 2 months. I'm on the flight deck walking around, and here comes this second class with this other sailor in tow, and he said, "Go ahead and tell him." So this sailor told me whatever it was, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, blah blah blah. We'll work on that." And he says, "See, I told you you could trust him." So it's people watch and pay attention, right? And it just starts with communications, verbal and nonverbal communication. Um, yeah, it's amazing how much of an impact that can make. So, have you heard or had some success? Listen, for what you're doing, if you just want to focus on suicide, if you prevented one, it's success. So there is no number to measure success, I think, beyond one. Um, but is there any, because we're getting close to the end here, is there any success stories from your podcast that anybody's shared with you?
So, from my podcast specifically, I mean, I get messages all the time from people, and a lot of them are more along the lines of like, "Hey, thank you for this episode. I really related to that person." I've even made connections with people between guests on my podcast and other people that have reached out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and said, "Hey, I really, really resonated with this person's story. Could you connect me with him or her? I have questions. I want to learn more," and that always gives me so much satisfaction, and it really keeps me going, because it's like, wow, there's people that whose lives are really being impacted by this. um and it's so beautiful, because every guest that I have on, I know how much vulnerability it takes to share your story on a public platform. And I tell people all the time, like, I don't care if your story is 5 minutes, I don't care if it's 5 hours, your story matters. Because I have some people sometimes that are like, "Oh, well, my story's not that cool." And I'm like, okay, but it's not about the publicity. It's not about like, oh, who has the story that's going to get me the most listens, or one person could listen to it. It impacted one life. That makes a difference. And it, to me, that's what matters the most.
Yeah. So what piece of advice would you give someone listening now who may be struggling with mental health, be it suicide or just, maybe depressed or anxious? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say find what works for you, and if it's too heavy and you can't find something that works for you, reach out to someone that you trust. And that person doesn't have to be in the military. That person could be a friend, a family member back home, and you don't have to tell them anything that's going on in your life if you don't want to. I think sometimes we have this idea that when we're struggling with mental health, we have to spill out everything that's going on, right? But you can just share as much or as little as you want with someone. But I think just sometimes talking to someone and knowing that someone's there for you, it makes a world of a difference. And I'm going to add something to this too. On the flip side, if someone comes to you and they want to talk to you, just listen. That could be someone's life or death situation. So that's probably the number one piece of advice that I would give.
That's fantastic. That's great. So tell us, where can we learn more? Where can we find your podcast?
Yeah, so my podcast, Your Story Doesn't End Here. It's on all major podcasting platforms, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts. My website should be up here in the next couple of weeks. It's www.ysdeh.com. It's the acronym for Your Story Doesn't End Here. And then also getting the YouTube channel set up soon, also under Your Story Doesn't End Here. But I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, and I'll give you all those links for anyone that wants to follow and check everything out.
Well, Rachel, I really appreciate what you've done and the impact that you're making. Sometimes the impact is one person at a time, and there's a big military, but but also multiplies, and I think it's very commendable. So I appreciate it. And
Thank you.
I'm going to give you the final word before we sign off. Any final message you want to give?
Yeah, I just want to tell everyone that if you're listening, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what position of life you're in, you truly do matter. And life gets heavy sometimes. Life's always going to be a roller coaster. There's never going to be a perfect life where we're just happy all day, every single day. But know that you have support. You have people that are fighting for you. Whether you know it or not, there are so many people out there that are fighting for you to have a better life in the military, outside of the military, and just keep going.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank everyone for tuning in to another edition of Lead On Lessons from Military Leaders. You've been listening to a conversation with Petty Officer Rachel Oswalt, former Petty Officer, Navy veteran, in doing her part to affect change in the lives of military and veterans with regards to mental health. You can tune in every couple of weeks, every other Friday, another podcast is dropped. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Send your feedback as well. You can send an email simply to admin@elf365.org. I'm David Deary with Enlisted Leadership Foundation. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Produced by Podcast Architects.